These are two sisters, daughters of the most perfect woman and man ever created. Their names are Ruqayya and Khulthum, and they are the daughters of Khadijah and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Join Sunnah followers every Monday and Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern as we share stories of the heroines of Islam. Alhamdulillah, wa salat, wa salam ala wa rasulullah. Welcome to my series on the heroines of Islam. This is my series on the heroines of Islam, and this has become one of the most provocative series that I teach here at Sunnah Followers, because very few Muslims know about the female companions of Islam. I mean, we hear about some of the regulars like Ibn Umar, radiallahu anha, Ibn Abbas, Umar, Abu Bakr. We hear about Aisha and Sauda and Khadijah and Fatima. But we don't go into much detail about the other companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even his family. A lot of sisters here have asked me to speak about, his daughters. So I did the story of Zainab radiallahu anha, who was his oldest daughter, and her story was very sad. As you guys saw, she married and her husband, who she loved so much, she had to leave him. Why? Because when her father received the call to prophethood, she embraced Islam and her husband didn't. So her story was a story of sacrifice, how she had to give up the love of her life, and for the sake of Allah. And she did it without hesitation, which is something that we women today can learn from, because so many Muslim women today are in marriages that are not lawful in Islam. They're Muslim and their husbands are not Muslim, and these sisters don't want to accept the gravity of the situation, how this is a horrific crime, a horrific sin in Islam. So we did Zainab's story, and then we also did the story of her younger sister, Fatima radiallahu anha. And we already know that Fatima is one of the four most perfect women ever created. Out of all her sisters, she was the strongest of them all. And she was the one who resembled her father the most. And then the other day we did the story of Ruqayya radiallahu anha, who was the second oldest of the daughters of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and her story was so sad. Okay, and today we're gonna do the last daughter, Khulthum, who was born just a year after Ruqayya. Khulthum, who was very close, not only in age, but also in relations with Ruqayya. They were like two twins. You would never see one without the other. So with that said, let's put the PowerPoint up on the screen and let's embark upon this journey of learning, what true love and true sacrifice is for the sake of Allah is all about. So let's put the PowerPoint. And again, this is the story of Khulthum. Khulthum, who was the third oldest daughter of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the life of Khulthum is not obscure, nor is she part of the marginal books of history. There is not much written about her. And the reason being is because she didn't live long enough to make that type of legacy. She's the fourth daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And of course, her mother was Khadija radiyallahu anha. And when her father, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, announced to the world that he had been chosen by Allah as a messenger and a prophet of mankind, she, along with her mother and other sisters, pledged their allegiance to him and converted to Islam. And this happened at a very precarious time, because she and her sister Ruqayya had just gotten married. They had both reached the age of marriage, and they had married the two sons of Abu Lahab, who was their uncle. So Ruqayya married Utbah, and Khulthum married Utayba. But neither one of these women got to enjoy the life of a bride, because as soon as they were married, that's when the Prophet received that call. And that's when they announced their allegiance to him as a prophet of Allah. And the Quraysh were so angry that they went to her father-in-law and told him to make his sons divorce them. And back in those days, guys, you talk about humiliation. The worst humiliation for any woman to go through, besides being raped or prostituted back in the dark ages, was to be married and the marriage not consummated. Instead, she was married today, and then tomorrow you turn her back to her father. That's humiliation. That's a black stain on the family. That means that something is wrong with this woman. So that's how Ruqayya and her sister Khulthum were humiliated by the Quraysh. The Quraysh convinced Abu Lahab to get his sons to humiliate the Prophet Muhammad by divorcing his wives without even consummating the marriage. And so Abu Lahab, he went to his sons and he swore an oath that he would excommunicate them both if they did not immediately divorce their wives and send them back to the Prophet. And so they did. In fact, Abu Lahab told them, I will have nothing to do with you if you too do not divorce the daughters of Muhammad. And being excommunicated is one of the worst experiences that a man back in those days could go through, especially if his father was a wealthy leader like their father Abu Lahab was. So without hesitation, these two men immediately divorced and sent their wives packing back to their home. And again, imagine the humiliation. You were still in your henna. The women still had their henna on. Were not even allowed to consummate the wedding. Just sent packing back to their father. Disgraced. Now, some historians have told us that Khulthum's husband, Utbah. Now, everybody knows Utayba, he never accepted Islam. Her husband, Khulthum's husband, Utayba, never converted to Islam. His brother ended up converting, and his story is a different story that you will hear about from my cousin Mukhtar. He and his other brothers became good Muslims later on in life. But Khulthum's husband, Utayba, never accepted Islam, and he died a kafir. And we have different hadiths. Some people question whether this hadith is authentic or not, but I'm going to share this one because I believe this one is. We have this incident, whereas Utayba, who was the husband of Khulthum, after he sent her back to the Prophet, he used to harass the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at any opportunity he got. And they say one day, he went up to the Prophet Muhammad while the Prophet was standing outside the Kaaba, and he grabbed hold of his garment and pulled it so hard that he ripped his garment, tore his garment. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was with his daughter Fatima when this happened. And as Fatima went to help her father, they say the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam turned at Utayba and cursed him. He said, "O Allah, set upon him a beast from your beast." So they say not too long after that, when Utayba was amongst a trading caravan in Syria, he was attacked by a lion. A lion came out of nowhere and ripped him to pieces, you know. So that's one of the stories that we have about his death. So, but I want you guys to know, you know, he died a kafir. Khulthum's ex-husband never embraced Islam. He remained an enemy to the Muslims, even though his other brothers eventually became Muslim. Now, during this time, as we talked about when I did the story of her sister Ruqayya, the Muslims were persecuted so bad that Allah sent down the command for the Muslims to migrate to Abyssinia. Khulthum was very close to her sister Ruqayya. Ruqayya had married, and her husband, Uthman, radiallahu anha, migrated to Abyssinia, to Ethiopia. They were amongst the first group of Muslims to go to Ethiopia. Khulthum stayed home with her baby sister Fatima, and they would help their mother and help their father to try to spread the word of Islam. Remember, we talked about how everyone is of different levels as to what we can take. Out of all the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's daughters, Ruqayya was the weakest physically. And that's why the Prophet sent her away to Ethiopia, because she couldn't handle the abuse that the Muslims were experiencing in Mecca. But Khulthum, she stayed home because she was stronger. She was able to handle the abuse better than her older sister. Plus, she wanted to help her father and mother. And Fatima was her younger sister. So Khulthum stayed back in Mecca with her mother and father and helped in the dawah. And she patiently endured the bitter pains of the early stages of Islam, when the unbelievers, you know, were meting out all their persecution. She was able to handle it. And then the Quraysh came up with this idea that my cousin Mukhtar spoke about yesterday, the boycott. When the Quraysh realized that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not going to stop calling to this new religion, they put together this boycott against his whole tribe. So for 3 long years, Khulthum and all the rest of the Muslims were exiled in the valley of Abu Talib. Okay. And subhanAllah, that was the roughest time that those Muslims faced. They had no food, they had no water. And Khulthum was a young girl. She was very hungry. She lost a lot of weight. She was very malnourished. But alhamdulillah, she handled the trials with dignity, helping her mother, helping her father in the dawah effort. But it was also during this time, guys, when this struggle took its toll on Khulthum's mother, Khadija. During those 3 years, Khadija became sick. So Khulthum stood by her mother's side, caring for her and helping her father too. After the boycott ended, that boycott took its toll on the old lady Khadija, radiallahu anha. So Khulthum had to go through another trial, and that was the trial of her mother dying. She mourned her mother's death, but in between mourning her mother's death, she had to also look out for her father and her younger sister Fatima, because also that's the same year in which Abu Talib died too. So her father lost his 2 great supporters. He lost her mother, Khadija, radiallahu anha, and he lost his uncle, who was his protector. So Khulthum couldn't mourn the way she wanted to, because she had to step up to the plate and play the role of her mother and big sister to her father and her sister Fatima. So here we can see this was the struggle with Khulthum, a struggle of patience, a struggle of trial after trial. We complain about our lives today. Our complaints are nothing. Oh, I complain because my husband don't spend enough time with me. Oh, I complain because I want to go out and get a job, or I'm tired of being in the house. Look at what these women had to endure. The humiliation of being sent back after being married to your father. The humiliation of being persecuted for your religious belief. The humiliation of being boycotted and ousted to the mountains to live off the land. The humiliation of having to bury your mother and at the same time step up to the plate to fulfill her role, to your sister and help your father. These women didn't have much in regards to happiness in this world. Okay? So after the boycott ended, the Quraysh did not show any sign of ending their harassment. Instead, they upped their game in persecuting and torturing the Muslims. Finally, it got so bad that Allah sent down another command telling the Muslims that they could no longer live in Mecca, that they would have to migrate to another city altogether, and that was the city of Medina. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he migrated, as we all know, with Abu Bakr in secret. But he had to leave his daughters in the care of his new wife, Sauda. After he and Abu Bakr arrived in Medina, that's when the Prophet sent Zayd to come get Khulthum, Fatima, and the rest of Abu Bakr's family. And just to let you guys know, back in those days, there were no airplanes. There were no Greyhound buses. Now, if you want to make Hajj and then go visit Medina, you can get on the bus. They didn't have buses then. How did they travel? They traveled by camel. How long did it take? I did the research for you guys. That was a question that one of the brothers asked. How long did it take to go from Mecca to Medina back in the Prophet's times? The fastest route, it took 14 days. So just so you guys know, on a good day, if there was no storms, no snow, no sandstorms, and if you weren't getting hijacked, carjacked, cameljacked, back then it was cameljacking. If you weren't cameljacked and the weather was good, you could get there in 14 days. So that's how long it took for the Muslims to travel from Mecca to Medina on camel, 14 days. Okay? And after Khulthum arrived in Mecca and Medina with the rest of her sister and the rest of the Prophet's family, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had a home built for them, and she lived in the home with her stepmother Sauda and Sauda's children, and also her daughter, her sister Fatima. They lived in that house together, helping her father for 2 years. Okay. After 2 years, and by the way, that's when she was also reunited with Ruqayya, because remember, that's when also the Muslims ended up migrating from Ethiopia to Medina. So the good thing was she was reunited eventually with her closest sister, Ruqayya. And after 2 years, that's when the Battle of Badr occurred. And once again, Khulthum felt herself going through another depression, because it was after the Battle of Badr that her closest friend and her closest sister, Ruqayya, died. Subhanallah. So here you can see there were only increments of contentment that these Muslims experienced. Maybe a year, maybe 2 years at the most. So she was able to live in Medina for 2 years without being persecuted. Plus she was together with her family. But right after 2 years, here comes the battle. And her sister, her beloved sister and best friend, dies. Okay? But the good thing that happened here was after the wounds of separation healed, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam married Khulthum to Ruqayya's husband, Uthman, radiallahu anha. Okay, so the Prophet married her to the best man available, which was Uthman. And also, guys, she had a happy life with him. Uthman loved her. They lived a blissful life, helping to establish the flag of Islam and being a multimillionaire, the same way Uthman was the best husband to her sister and gave her a nice home and nice things. He did the same for Khulthum. The only thing was she didn't have any children by him. Okay? How long did she and Uthman enjoy their matrimony? For 6 years. So she and Uthman, radiallahu anha, lived together for 6 years as husband and wife. But then, after 6 years, the same thing that happened to her sister happened to her. She caught a cold. She caught a fever. And she was bedridden for many days. Once again, Uthman found himself in the same predicament he was in with his first wife, her sister. He stayed by her side. and she ended up dying. She died in the 9th year after they migrated. And when she died, her death left a deep wound in the hearts of her husband and her father. Imagine how the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam felt. Here's another child he had to bury. And the Prophet was close to all his daughters. No parent likes to bury their child. And they say the Prophet took this one bad. I mean, he had to deal with Zainab, and then the death of Ruqayya, and now Khulthum, who was with him and helped him get through the death of her mother, Khadijah. So when she died, it was hard for the Prophet. So he instructed Atiyah, radiallahu anha. And Atiyah, she's the Muslim woman. I'm going to give her story to you guys too another day. She was the one that tells us in Sahih Bukhari that the Muslim women never wore dark colors. They never wore black. They never wore any dark colors unless they were mourning the death of someone. She's also the one that tells us that Aisha, radiallahu anha, never wore white. Aisha never wore white because white made her look too pale. Okay? We get a lot of knowledge about women's dress and makeup. Atiyah is also the one in Bukhari that tells us that the Muslim woman can show her face and her makeup. That Aisha would wear kohol. So did all the Muslim women, including her. All the Arabic women wore makeup, which is kohol. Kohol is makeup. Okay? Well, when Khulthum died, the Prophet instructed Atiyah. He told her, wash her body 3 times. And then he gave her his lower garment to use as part of her shroud. And after Khulthum was buried, the Prophet stood at her grave and tears flowed from his eyes. And Anas ibn Malik, radiallahu anhu, he tells us, he said, we were standing at the burial of the daughter, Khulthum, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sat at her gravesite, and I saw the tears streaming down his cheeks. And then he made the announcement. He said, no one should enter her grave unless you did not have sexual relations the night before. Is there anyone here who has not had relations the night before? And Abu Talha spoke up. He said, I didn't. And that's when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam allowed Abu Talha to enter her grave to do the laying down and all of that. And this hadith is authentic. This hadith is in Sahih Bukhari. So here we can see the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam emphasized good self-restraint. But you could see the hurt on his face of having to bury yet another one of his children. The tears rolled down his face, but there was no screaming. There was no yelling. There was no slapping the face or none of that. And after her burial was completed, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam looked at Uthman, who was so grief-stricken that he was just standing there as if he was in a coma. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam felt for Uthman because this was the second wife Uthman had to bury. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told him to console him. He said, "Oh, Uthman, you are a good man. If I had 10 daughters, I would marry them one after the other to you." And that made Uthman feel better. So basically, that's it. That's all we have on Khulthum. She didn't live long enough to have any children. It was probably for the better. Okay? Allah is always in control. Remember, her sister, Ruqayya, had one child. Okay? She spent most of her adulthood helping her mother, helping her father spread the message of Islam, just like her younger sister Fatima did. And again, like I told you guys in the earlier class, this world is not meant to be a paradise for any of us who truly believe in Allah. A lot of you sisters will call me on the phone or complain to me about how unhappy you are in your lives. Well, welcome to the club. We all put up a good front. We dress nicely to try to make ourselves feel better. We sit on the internet and speak about Allah and his religion to try to make others feel better and ourselves too. But we're all wearing a mask, including me. We all are just wearing a mask because deep down inside, I'm crushed and I'm hurting too. You know, life is not meant to be a paradise for any of us in this world who believe in Allah. This world is just a test for us. Like I said, look at Khulthum. She can count on one hand, not two. One hand, the amount of happiness she had. Happy when she converted to Islam. Happy when she thought she was getting married. Happy when she migrated to join her father in Medina. Happy when she married again. Happy when she hooked up with her sister Ruqayya. And that's it. Then she died. 5, just one hand. We can only count 5 increments of happiness for Khulthum. And that's what keeps me going, sisters. For those of you who call me, who I talk to today, because life, it seems like it's caving in on you. Welcome to the reality. Welcome to the real world. When I find life caving in on me, life is nothing but one disappointment after another. As soon as I get my hopes up that something good's gonna happen, bam, it's taken away from me. And that's what you guys are going through too. We get our hopes up and somebody crushes us. Hopes up, crush us. Hope up, crush us. But what keeps me going is I think about these female companions. I can count 10 incidents. I have 10 incidents that I can honestly count and say that those were increments of happiness for me. Ruqayya only had 5. Khulthum only had 5. Zainab, radiallahu anha, only had 5. Salama only had 5. So who am I to complain about my silly problems? Because I don't have a husband, because I can't pay the rent today, because my children disappoint me, the neighbors complaining, I want to go grocery shopping, but it's snowing. We complain over silly things like that. These women, 5. Think about that. The next time you start feeling sorry for yourself, think about her. Think about these heroines of Islam that I've taught you about so far. 5. Nobody's gotten past 5 increments of happiness yet. And I've done the story of all the wives of the prophet, all his daughters, and we cannot count no more than 5 increments. That's something for us sisters to think about when we feeling sorry for ourselves. You better woman up. You ain't got a husband, you don't need one. You're doing fine. If you ain't got a husband in this world, what does that mean? That means Allah got one for you in paradise. Maybe you're going to marry the prophet. Maybe you're going to marry Uthman. Maybe Umar's waiting for you. Maybe it's Abu Bakr. So you sisters got to stop all this complaining because you ain't got a husband. Who needs one? You doing a good job taking care of yourself. And maybe the men here ain't deserving of you. Maybe you too way up here for them. Those companions, they're flying around the throne of Allah. Maybe the prophet got his eye on you. Maybe he's saying, I want her, Allah. I want her, Allah. Think like that. You can count more than 5 increments of happiness. All right, I'm going to stop right here. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. And those are the only. We've covered all the female children of the prophet. As far as his biological, that's all he had. Zainab, Ruqayya, Khulthum, Fatima. Those were his biological daughters. He had stepdaughters too. And I'm going to, inshallah, speak about them in the upcoming weeks, okay? All right, so subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Any questions or comments? You can go ahead with them.